I'm Greg Wheatley, and my guest today on Inside Wheaton is Dr. Stephen Moshier. Steve is professor of geology in the Geology and Environmental Science Department at Wheaton College, serves as the department chair, also is director of the Black Hills Science Station, and we'll get to know a little bit about that, ask what that's all about in just a moment. But Steve, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And always fun to meet somebody that's got an interest like jazz music. I mean, my goodness. That's a little-known fact, I suppose, about a geology professor, huh?
Well, it's because of my sons are jazz musicians. One son professionally, and then the other is a pretty good drummer. Mm-hmm. And I've learned so much from them going to different venues and
following them around a little bit.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm a jazz dad.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it takes those. Yeah, I know. It takes those. Let me start, Steve, by asking you about the Black Hills Science Center. This is an interesting component of the science department at Wheaton.
Oh, it's an absolute gem for our division. The science station goes back to 1935, and we've done some research in our archives and found that the ideas go all the way back to Charles Blanchard. And the idea, of course, was to establish a Western outpost for field study in geology and biology. That's one of the things that makes it unique is that many colleges or universities will have a geology field station or a biology field station. Ours is much more interdisciplinary. So in 1935, two professors, Professor Alan Higley, who was a chemist, and Professor John Leedy, who was a botanist, went to the Black Hills, and they stayed at a YWCA camp with the students. It was a very informal thing, but it was so successful that the next year it was in the college catalog, and we have been going every summer ever since. Used the YWCA camp for about 10 years, and then when their lease was up on that, the college purchased I think initially about 20 acres of land, not far from that WCA camp, and YWCA camp, and then over the years added to the acreage, so it's almost 50 acres now, and it's nestled in national forest. Even though there is a bit of a housing development on one side, you wouldn't know it if you were on the campus. You'd feel like you were in a park or something.
Interesting. So is summer program?
Summer program, we're only there for 2 months. We generally get started sometime after Memorial Day and stay until the Sturgis rally essentially boots us out of the Black Hills. It gets pretty crazy there, and our program is done by August 1st.
Mm-hmm. So does the program vary year to year? I mean, you're going to study this year, we're going to do this year?
No, it's more of an educational program, so we offer pretty much the same courses. They change over the years, but we have a program of general education classes for students who need to complete general education courses in the sciences. And that's marvelous because here we have business econ majors and art majors and humanities majors that are taking field courses in geology, astronomy, and environmental science, and they love it. You know, they're taking one class at a time, and they thrive in a small field setting. Then for the biology and environmental science majors, or anyone who needs to complete the introductory courses in biology, they have a field version of their second and third introductory courses out there. So that's a marvelous way to take those courses. That biology class includes a trip to Yellowstone, so it's a pretty cool thing. And then the geology majors are required to take a field methods class out there where they make their own geological maps, and they learn many of the field methods that are bread and butter to doing geological work.
Yeah. Well, it might be that you're interested in that, even hearing that in talking with Wheaton College about a science major. Just go to wheaton.edu. You can research all of that and ask questions as well. Steve, I want to jump right in with this idea of you're a geologist. Mm-hmm. You study, anytime you're in a Christian college and you study those kinds of sciences, you're right smack up against some pretty interesting questions.
Yes, absolutely.
And in fact, I was so glad you sent over a paper just before you got here that you had written about the history of teaching geology at Wheaton College. I I want to talk about that for just a minute, because I think a lot of people listening now, maybe they're parents and they're thinking about science at Wheaton. This whole issue of how you get at science and faith is a really big thing, isn't it?
Well, what was exciting for us, and I want to mention my co-authors, historian David Moss, who's now an emeritus professor, and my colleague Jeff Greenberg. David knows the Wheaton archives, the 19th century material through the 20th century. And as we were interested in this question, he was reading the letters of Jonathan Blanchard and the notes of Charles Blanchard, and they were from the beginning interested in having science as part of the curriculum. Jonathan Blanchard had studied at a college in New England. He was very interested in natural history. He had been the president of Knox College, and they had a very popular and beloved natural science professor there. Everything back then was natural science in the 19th century. When he got to Wheaton, it turned out that a prominent, promising student had left Wheaton. It was becoming Wheaton. It had been the Illinois Institute. This young man had left Wheaton because there had been no science class. Well, that turned out to be John Wesley Powell, who ended up as the explorer of the Grand Canyon and would have been a very prominent alumni.
What a story.
But even as a young man, he showed this great promise. So one of the very first person that Jonathan Blanchard hired was a natural scientist who had studied a lot of geology and had studied under many prominent professors doing geology at that time, including Louis Agassiz at Harvard and Benjamin Silliman. I think he was at Yale. And Blanchard actually reached out to these prominent men of science in the late 19th century. And many of them some of them were ordained as ministers in the church. And they had recommended this young man named Frederick Barker to come to Wheaton. And he was here, and he was teaching what we would call today Darwinian evolution and theories of the origin of the solar system that would have involved long periods of time. They had no idea, but it was very interesting to us to find out that Wheaton was engaging with the sciences and finding ways to understand it from a biblical perspective, but still respected the science.
Yeah. Which brings us, of course, to today, because anybody, if you don't have your head in the sand, you know that there's a lot of, I would call it war between science and those who believe that we're at loggerheads with faith as Christians. You co-teach a class here on theories of origins.
That's right.
So that, again, is going to put you right in the sort of ground zero of this thing. Would you help us understand how an evangelical Christian and an evangelical Christian college approaches that issue?
Well, one of the first things that we like to do is diffuse that warfare mentality, because both sides are using it now. It is a culture war, we call it, and Dr. Larson has done some very interesting history on the way that science was perceived in the 19th century and how sometimes it was used to sort of kick the theologians out of the discussion. But today it's often used as sort of a wedge between faith and science, and it really shouldn't be. As theists, as Christians, our overall presupposition is that God created and He creates. But then it gets to the matter of interpretation. Is the Bible a science textbook, or is it a revelation of God's relationship to what He created, using language that isn't necessarily scientific? I mean, it talks about things like sun and moon and stuff, but is it really about the science of creation, or is it about and the process, or is it about the relationship between God and the creation? And so there's a way to approach it that can respect the authority of Scripture and also the findings of science.
It seems to me there's a couple of camps of people that I've run into, and I'm talking about Christians now.
Sure.
Some would have what I perceive to be your view of sort of an openness to, certainly we drive the stake in the ground to say God did this.
Absolutely.
He is our creator. we're comfortable being open with how he did it.
Yes.
Then you have the other camp that says, well, the Bible tells us exactly how he did it, and they, I would think, read it a little bit as a science textbook.
Absolutely.
There's probably a continuum that runs between those two.
Absolutely a continuum, and there's been a continuum here at Wheaton College. There are many different approaches to how you will,
Do we have all of those represented here?
Well, I think that they're probably all represented, but there's not a sort of a proportionate division of people from the time of the early 20th century. For example, Buswell was a day age creationist. He saw
which briefly means
which
what?
means that he accepted the findings of science that the Earth was very, very old and in excess of some kind of calculation using biblical chronologies of 6,000 years, and that the days may have represented long periods of geologic time. And then Higley, who I mentioned, founder of the Science Station, actually wrote in Moody Monthly about an idea that was popular, and it was in the Schofield Bible, called ruin and restoration, idea that the ages of the earth that we see in geology and in astronomy are in the first two verses of the Bible, and that God does an act of recreation in 6 days.
That's the gap.
Restores.
Is that the gap
That's
theory?
the gap theory.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So here we had at Wheaton College two prominent people, including the president, who were old earthers, if you will. They disagreed with how they interpreted the Bible, but they did not embrace a strict, literal, what we might call a young earth creationist view.
Yeah. As you read the scriptures for yourself, and as you're a scientist, a geologist, can you come to any conclusion that says we have an earth that is that young?
I have not found any scientific proof, or, well, proof is not always a good word in science, but evidence.
Evidence.
I think the evidence from my study of the Earth is that it is a very wonderfully old
how
creation.
old do you think?
Well, the dating that's done on the oldest rocks, not just on the Earth, but on the Moon, meteorites, takes us back to 4.5 billion years, and then the universe going another 8 or 9 billion years beyond that, 13 some billion years. So there's so many lines of evidence that the conclusion that most scientists come to, and I would say most scientists who are Christians come to, is that the creation is very, very old.
Does that kind of boggles the mind, doesn't it? Does that? Where are we in terms of credibility issues when we argue for a young earth then? Is there a problem with those in the academy who are not believers?
Yes.
Saying, how do you guys come up with this?
Yeah, it is, I think, a credibility issue, and there have been some studies that show that it's a turn off to witness. It's a deal breaker. If I've got to believe that creation is.
Of course, the other side is going to say, aren't they, Steve? Well, you just are. You need to stand up for your faith.
Sure.
You're being persecuted in a sense by these people who.
And I understand that. I am not a theologian or a Bible scholar, and so I can do my geological work and I can think about that, from a geologist's perspective. But I do depend on Bible scholars and theologians. And fortunately, I have many wonderful colleagues here at the college. They're all under this roof, aren't they? They are, and they have been very helpful, and they're very insightful and supportive of what we're doing in the sciences and what we're teaching. And they provide us with an understanding, or help us to understand what the scriptures mean in those cases. So I certainly respect someone who comes to a young earth view from their study of scripture, and I wouldn't argue with them on that. I understand that is of course you could take. What I can do is engage them on the geological evidence for
level.
It. Exactly.
Yeah. Let's turn to what you call Geo Archeology. Well, that's probably not your term.
Well,
but
it's a good term.
It's a good term. Tell me something exciting that's going on right now in terms of a discovery.
Geo Archeology is where geology is basically used in the service of archaeological problems. So geologists have skills that very much overlap with an archaeologist. When you think about it, archaeologists are digging and they're sifting through sediment,
getting
and
their hands dirty.
They're looking for artifacts, and geologists do much the same. If you're studying paleontology or any kind of reconstructing an ancient landscape or ancient setting. So there are ways that the methods of geology can be used to answer questions of why were people here, what were the resources for their ceramics or their metals, and how did they get fresh water, or why did they occupy this land rather than other land, or have rivers moved or coastlines migrated. And geologists can be involved and are involved in most larger archaeological expeditions. And I've been privileged to be a part of 2 different archaeological expeditions.
Tell me about, and this is really timely, I'm reading my way through Exodus right now. So this is a great topic. I'm going to get all my questions answered right here. You did, I saw part of a lecture online that you did with James Hoffmeyer, who's from Trinity.
Yes.
And yourself talking about the Exodus, evidence for where these Israelites actually crossed, where Mount Sinai is. And I got just far enough through here to see there are lots of little red circles and kind of nobody's sure.
Certainly.
Talk about what we know about the Exodus.
I think what's exciting about the Exodus narrative and the itinerary is that it's geography. There are places that we ought to be or can identify on the ground. Now there's debate about where those places are, but the more we learn about not what's on your modern Bible map, but what the map looked like in the Bronze Age or in the Iron Age, then we can really begin to put it in a geographic context. For example, Pi-Ramesses, which is the capital city where everything happens between Pharaoh and Moses, that wasn't even known as a place on the ground until sometime in the 20th century. There was an example of something that archaeologists found this place that was only known from the Bible, and now it's well established. It was a Ramesside and other earlier pharaonic times as well. So to be able to think about where was the Reed Sea or the Red Sea and where was Mount Sinai are, I think, reasonable questions to ask. Even those critics who would say, oh, it's just some kind of memory of something maybe that happened and it was embellished. Well, it's actually, these are actual places.
It's not written that way, is it? It doesn't sound like it's some kind of myth.
It's written like people were walking a path and a route. And certainly there are different ideas. And in our lectures that Jim and I give, when we gave this lecture at Wheaton College some years ago, we call it Moses Didn't Sleep Here. And there are many popular ideas out there. There are books, there are documentaries, and we feel that many of them don't really have much merit, but nonetheless they're very popular. So we thought we would just throw out some of our critiques of those
rebel rousers.
Exactly.
Do you have, we've just got a couple moments left here, is there, from all of the evidence you've been able to amass, is there a spot where you would say, probably reasonably, this may be where the crossing happened?
Yeah, we think that the area of near the Sinai Suez Canal zone, which would be due east of Pi-Ramesses, right about where the Suez Canal is. There was a lake, an inland lake, and it's called the Bala Lakes. They were actually drained when the Suez Canal was built in the late 19th century. We think that fits in many ways, even linguistically. Some of the names for this lake fit with the description.
So it's not at all what this is your idea of the modern map problem, right? It's not at all what we call the Red Sea now. And that's misleading to us, isn't it?
It is, yeah. One of my talks has been called Better Bible Maps, because the map that we have has a coastline there that's tens of kilometers seaward of where it was in the Bronze Age. So there, we know now that there were a string of forts, Egyptian forts, along what was called the Ways of Horus, or later the Ways of the Philistines. And this was basically the highway between Egypt and Canaan, and that it would have been, certainly known to Moses. It would have been a place where it fits with an army being close by. Pharaoh's army couldn't have gone all the way across the Sinai on chariots. It would just be impossible. But this geography that's being reconstructed makes a lot of sense.
How wide would that body of water be?
My estimates are that it varied from the seasons and seasons, because I believe that it was related to the Nile drainage, so you'd have ups and downs, and that so sometimes it would have been wetlands with smaller lakes, and other times it might have been more fully flooded. So it would probably be maybe 20 kilometers wide, something like that, and probably not more than 6 to 10, maybe 12 meters deep. So it wasn't an ocean, or it wasn't like the Red Sea, but the proper translation, Yam Soup, is Reed Sea.
Fascinating topic. We'll have to have you back, and
thank you.
By then something brand new will be discovered, and we can talk about that. Are things happening often, quickly in these kinds of things?
It is a slow process because it's hard work going out there and doing the field work and the archaeology, but things come up all the time they're just absolutely fascinating.
Dr. Stephen Moshier, my guest. He is Professor of Geology and Department Chair in the Department of Geology and Environmental Science at Wheaton, and again, the Director of the Black Hills Program as well. Visit wheaton.edu to find out more about the department. For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheatley.